They came as prisoners, marched behind fences, still wearing the uniform of a defeated army. But instead of vengeance, America gave them shovels. And in the quiet of forests, fields, and small towns, something remarkable happened. German prisoners of war began building the very parks, roads, and farms of the country that had once called them enemies. This is the forgotten story of how captives helped shape America and found redemption in its soil, from the front lines to fences. By the spring of 1944, the tide of war had turned. The German army was retreating across Europe, and Allied ships were filling with prisoners, thousands of young men once certain of victory, now silent and defeated. Their uniforms were torn, their eyes hollow from months of fighting and hunger. But what awaited them across the ocean was not punishment, not torture, but something far stranger, captivity in the land they'd been told to hate. They were loaded onto ships under gray skies, expecting chains, humiliation, maybe death. Instead, they were given meals, blankets, and cigarettes. The journey across the Atlantic was quiet, broken only by the churn of engines and the disbelief of men who could not understand why their captors were kind. When they finally saw the American coast, vast, green, untouched by war, many felt as if they had landed on another planet. Buses and trains carried them inland to camps scattered across the United States, Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, the Carolinas. Each was surrounded by fences and guard towers, yet built with an efficiency that felt almost clinical. The prisoners braced for cruelty, but the discipline they encountered was different, firm, organized, and strangely fair. Under the Geneva Convention, they were not to be beaten, starved, or humiliated. America, it seemed, intended to win even in how it treated its enemies. When the gates closed behind them, many expected the weight of despair. But in those first quiet nights under American skies, surrounded by chirping crickets instead of artillery, something unexpected began to stir. They were alive, and perhaps in this strange new captivity, they would learn what that really meant. The war that ended but didn't. The war had ended for them, but not inside them. Behind the barbed wire, the prisoners still woke to the habits of soldiers, standing at attention, saluting out of reflex, whispering the names of cities now in ruins. Letters from home, when they came, spoke of hunger, rubble, and silence. For many, captivity in America was easier to endure than the thought of returning to what was left of Germany. The camps were small worlds of paradox. They were prisoners, yet they were fed, clothed, and sheltered better than civilians back home. They were surrounded by fences, yet the air was freer than the bomb-scorched streets of Berlin or Cologne. In time, boredom became their enemy, not fear, and to fight it, the Americans offered them something unthinkable: work. At first, the Germans hesitated. They had been told that the enemy would enslave them, but what they found was structure: digging irrigation ditches, cutting timber, repairing roads, harvesting crops. Payment came not in dollars but in camp scrip, small pieces of paper exchangeable for chocolate, soap, or tobacco. For the first time in years, their labor was not for conquest or destruction, but creation. Under the southern sun, rifles were replaced with shovels, fields turned green under hands that had once built fortifications, and as the days stretched on, something quietly shifted in their hearts. They were still captives, but in working the soil of the enemy, they were beginning to rediscover a truth war had stolen from them: the dignity of honest labor. Shovels instead of rifles. By summer, the sound of war had been replaced by the rhythm of labor: axes striking wood, shovels cutting into clay, hammers echoing across open fields. The prisoners rose with the sun, filed into trucks under guard, and were driven to farms, logging sites, and half-built public works projects. Each day began in silence, but by noon, the silence gave way to voices. German words mingled with the sounds of work and life. For many, the first weeks were bitter. They had fought for a nation that promised greatness, and now they were repairing fences and digging ditches in a country they were taught to despise. Yet, over time, something began to shift. They noticed that the guards didn't shout unless they had to. Farmers brought them cold water on hot days. Children sometimes waved as the trucks passed. It wasn't kindness in the way propaganda imagined it. It was normalcy, the quiet decency of people simply doing their work. In Texas and Louisiana, the prisoners cleared forests that would become new farmland. In Georgia, they leveled land for future parks. In small towns across the Midwest, they built picnic shelters, irrigation canals, and stone bridges. The pay was meager, a few cents in camp currency. But for men who had spent years destroying, the act of building something that would last felt strange, even healing. They were still behind fences, still watched by armed guards, but the lines between enemy and human were beginning to blur. As one man later wrote in his diary, "They took our rifles and gave us shovels, and somehow, in the turning of soil, I began to feel more free than I ever did with a weapon in my hand." The parks they planted. What began as labor soon turned into legacy. Across the American South and Midwest, the work of these German POWs reshaped the land in ways that would outlive them. They built stone walls, repaired trails, planted rows of trees that still stand today. Townspeople who once whispered about the Germans began to bring coffee to the work sites, or wave from porches as trucks rolled by. Suspicion slowly softened into curiosity, and in rare cases, quiet respect. At Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, POWs landscaped what would become part of the Chickamauga National Park. In Texas, they built picnic shelters that are still used today. In Louisiana, they restored levees damaged by storms, what the war had taught them to destroy. Captivity taught them to rebuild. For many, this transformation wasn't just physical, it was moral. They saw how America treated even its enemies, and it forced them to confront what their own nation had become. In their diaries, the tone changed, the bitterness faded, replaced by reflection. "I have dug the soil of a free country," one wrote, "and it has taught me more about strength than all the speeches of the Reich." When they paused to rest under the shade of trees they had planted themselves, the irony was not lost on them. They had once fought to conquer, and now they labored to create beauty in the land of their captors. And though few could admit it aloud, in those moments of work and quiet peace, some began to feel something like redemption. Letters home. Each week, the mail truck rolled through the gates, carrying thin envelopes stamped with censors' marks. For the German prisoners, those letters were lifelines, small windows into a world they no longer recognized. When the mail was handed out, silence fell. The men read them slowly, as if afraid the words might vanish if they breathed too hard. Most letters spoke of hunger and ruin. "The city is gone," one man's mother wrote from Cologne. "We sleep in the cellar now, where the rats are fewer." Others described scavenging for food, trading clothes for bread, or burying neighbors lost in the bombings. Reading such words while sitting under a clear American sky, well-fed and alive, filled the prisoners with shame they could barely endure. Some tried to reply with careful hope. "I am safe, I have work, we eat every day." But even that truth felt cruel. To say they were cared for by the enemy seemed almost like betrayal. Many folded their letters and tucked them away unread, as if silence could protect what little dignity remained. Anna's counterpart among them, a young man named Ernst, kept a diary of his own. "We write to the dead," he noted. "They live in the ruins, we live behind wire. Yet they are less imprisoned than we, for they still believe in something." In time, the letters changed. Desperation turned to numbness. Homes once filled with families were now rubble, and words of love arrived like ghosts. The prisoners began to realize that when the war ended, the lives they would return to might not exist at all. The thought made the camp, for all its fences, feel like the last safe place left on earth. The locals who changed everything. It started with small gestures. A farmer offering a cup of water on a hot day. A child waving shyly as trucks passed down dusty roads. In dozens of American towns, curiosity slowly replaced suspicion. People wanted to see the faces of the men who had once been the enemy. What they found were not monsters, but boys. Thin, tired, polite, many barely 20 years old. Some camps formed work partnerships with nearby farms, and trust began to build. Farmers found the Germans diligent and respectful. The Germans found the Americans fair. They shared tools, laughter, sometimes even stories. Language barriers blurred under the rhythm of labor. A few guards turned their backs when small kindnesses were exchanged. An extra apple, a cigarette, a word of thanks. Friendships, though forbidden, took root quietly. In Louisiana, a local baker began leaving loaves of bread by the fence each morning. In Texas, school children sneaked postcards to the camp with drawings of flowers and flags. These moments of humanity spread by rumor, whispered from camp to camp like secret miracles. For the Americans, it was an education too. Many guards wrote home saying, "They're not what we were told." Some even grew protective of their charges. One officer later said, "We expected bitterness, but we saw gratitude." And through those small interactions, the war's sharp edges dulled. The Germans were still prisoners, the Americans still victors, but something neither side expected had begun to grow: empathy. As one POW later reflected, "They did not win us by power, but by decency. And decency, once seen, can never be unseen. Freedom earned by work. By 1946, the work had become more than obligation. It was purpose. The German prisoners were no longer just building parks or fixing roads. They were rebuilding themselves. Each day began before sunrise, boots crunching over frost and gravel as they filed into trucks headed for another project. They dug irrigation ditches, repaired barns, built bridges. Their hands, once trained to destroy, now shaped the landscape of the country that had defeated them. The wages were small, just a few cents in camp scrip, but the feeling was priceless. For men stripped of rank, uniform, and homeland, work became a kind of dignity. They labored without resentment because for the first time in years their actions created instead of erased. They learned the value of effort measured not in conquest, but in usefulness. Some guards began to trust them enough to work outside the wire unsupervised. In rural communities, locals grew accustomed to seeing them walking dusty roads with shovels slung over their shoulders. They greeted them with nods, sometimes even with smiles. To outsiders, they were still the enemy, but to those who saw them daily, they had become something else entirely. Young men trying to find redemption through honest work. Inside the camps, morale shifted. The fences still stood, but the atmosphere changed. Prisoners began organizing music evenings, small lectures, even art classes. The same discipline once used for war was now turned toward creation. For a brief time, behind those fences, the world seemed capable of healing. As one former POW wrote decades later, "We lost the war with our weapons, but won back our humanity with our hands." A legacy hidden in plain sight. Across America, traces of their labor remain, though few who walk those paths know the story behind them. In Georgia's Fort Oglethorpe, the trees lining the parkways were planted by men who once wore the enemy's uniform. In Louisiana, stone picnic shelters still stand, their foundations poured by German hands. In Texas, bridges and drainage canals bear no plaques, yet they carry the mark of the prisoners who built them. For decades, the story stayed quiet. Locals remembered the German boys, who worked hard, smiled shyly, and vanished after the war. Most of the prisoners were repatriated by 1946, their fences torn down, their barracks dismantled, yet their legacy endured, not in monuments but in living landscapes. A few Americans later admitted they missed them. They were polite, hard-working, and grateful. One farmer recalled, "When they left, the place felt emptier." For the prisoners, those feelings were mutual. Many wrote from Germany years later, sending photos, even seeds as tokens of thanks. One letter read simply, "In your fields, we found peace." Today, few visitors walking through those parks realize they stand on the work of former enemies. Grass has grown over the footprints, trees have matured, and time has blurred the faces. Yet the truth remains. The hands that once fought for destruction helped shape a new world, quiet proof that redemption can take root even behind barbed wire. Returning home to ruins. When the orders came for repatriation, the camps fell silent. Men who had longed for freedom suddenly found themselves hesitant to take it. They packed what little they owned, a diary, a handmade trinket, a folded photograph, and lined up once again behind barbed wire, just as they had years before. But this time, it wasn't fear of captivity that filled them. It was fear of what waited beyond it. The trains carried them east, through small towns and farmlands they had once helped restore. Americans waved from porches. Some shouted goodbyes. Others simply stood watching, perhaps realizing that the line between prisoner and neighbor had quietly blurred. The journey across the ocean was colder now, the decks empty, the laughter gone. Ahead lay a homeland they barely recognized, a country divided, defeated, and scarred beyond recognition. When they arrived, many found their homes gone. Cities were husks of ash and broken stone. Families had vanished, graves unmarked. The Germany they returned to was a shadow of the one they had fought for. The transition from clean camps to the smell of rot and ruin was unbearable. Some tried to rebuild, but others admitted that part of them had stayed behind in America, not out of disloyalty, but because that was where they had remembered what humanity felt like. Letters to former guards and farmers began to circulate. They spoke not of politics or bitterness, but of gratitude. "You taught us to live again," one man wrote. Another, who had worked in Georgia planting trees, confessed, "When I touch the soil here, it feels dead. But in your fields it was alive." Freedom, they realized, wasn't the same as peace. For some, the fences of captivity had felt kinder than the open ruins of home. The enemy who built beauty. Years later, when the men were old and gray, Their children and grandchildren would ask them about the war. Most spoke of it sparingly, of loss, of foolish pride, of how easily men could be led into darkness. But when they mentioned America, their voices softened. They spoke of sunlight over southern fields, of laughter between guards and prisoners, of shovels and songs that filled the air where gunfire once had been. Some of those parks still exist, unnoticed by the people who walk them. The stone walls are mossed over, the trees tall, the benches worn smooth by decades of use. Yet in those quiet spaces lives the memory of something extraordinary, a moment when humanity overcame hatred, when prisoners built beauty in the land of their conquerors. Historians would later call it one of the most remarkable ironies of the war. The thousands of German POWs, raised in a culture of conquest, found their redemption in service, in peace, in creation. They came as enemies, left as men changed forever. As one of them wrote before his death, "We were sent across the sea in shame, but there in the soil of our enemy, we planted something good. It still grows, not the trees, not the fields, but the proof that mercy outlasts war." Their story endures not through monuments or medals, but through every leaf that rustles in those parks, every family that picnics beneath trees planted by the hands of those once called the enemy. It is the quietest kind of victory, and perhaps the most human one of all.